Hi, my name is Karen Latrèche. I'm a PhD student working in Geneva in Professor Stéphanie Alliet's group, and I would like to share some results on the developmental trajectories of verbal learning skills in 22q and their association with hippocampal development and psychosis. So the first part of the study, we were interested in the verbal learning trajectories and their association with hippocampal development. So a short introduction. So memory is a dynamic system that entails three core processes. So the first process is acquisition. So that's the part where we learn the new information. Then there is the storage, so where we store the new information. And finally, the recall, where we retrieve the stored information. In this study, we were particularly interested in the acquisition process, so really the part where we learn the information. And in 22q, we know that there is a dissociation between verbal learning and non-verbal learning. So individuals with 22q, they often have, it's often easier for them to learn words, for example, or stories, compared to non-verbal information such as the visual spatial information. And so verbal memory seems to be a relative strength in the cognitive profile in 22q, and it only has received little attention in the literature so far. And one first question that we had was, how do verbal learning skills develop and mature over time? Another point is that verbal learning and verbal memory are both relying on the same hippocampal structure in the brain. And in 22q, we know that there is some alteration in the hippocampus, and also that reduction in hippocampal volume are associated with deficits in verbal retention skills. So another question that we had was, what are the developmental trajectories of hippocampal volume in relation to verbal learning in 22q? And to answer both of these questions, we had a group of over 300 participants divided between healthy controls and participants with 22q, who were aged from 5 to 30 years old. And each of them was assessed with the same task, so the verbal paired associates task, where we read word pairs to the participants and they have to listen. And then we tell them the first word and they have to recall the second word. And this is repeated during several trials. And at the end, we have a learning percentage score, which accounts for how much they were able to learn during these trials. So for the results, you can see here on this graph the age, so from 5 to 30 years old, and here the learning percentage. In red, there's the 22q group, and in blue, the control group. And what we can see here first is that the 22q group seemed to have a lower verbal learning performance, and also that this 22q group shows smaller improvement with age. So we can see that from around 15 years old, they seem to reach a plateau, while the control group continues to improve over time. What we can see also is that the group with 22q has really high heterogeneity in their verbal learning skills. So some of them score really low, while some of them score really high. And in order to understand this heterogeneity, we were interested in the development of hippocampus. So we divided our 22q group between those who had a lower and those who had a higher verbal learning performance. And we can see that those who had a lower verbal performance also had a lower increase in a specific subfield of hippocampus, which is the left tail volume. And as you can see here, so they had lower volume of the left tail subfield compared to those who had a higher verbal learning performance. In the second part of the study, we were interested in the association between verbal learning and psychosis. So 22q is associated with a higher risk of developing psychotic symptoms and psychotic disorders. And in both 22q and in the general population, there is psychosis is linked to a cognitive decline that occurs before the onset of symptoms. And this cognitive decline is affecting several domains, but mainly the verbal domain. So one challenge right now is to identify those who are at higher risk of developing psychosis. And for example, one previous study showed that 22q participants who had psychosis or who later developed psychosis show a decrease in their verbal IQ points, while those who do not have psychosis do not show that much of a decrease over time. So one question here that we had was, could verbal learning skills be considered as an early cognitive marker of psychosis in 22q? And to answer this question, we divided our 22q group into subgroups. So first, we considered the moderate to severe positive psychotic symptoms, so those who had symptoms and those who didn't have any psychotic symptoms. And then we divided our group between those who had a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder and those who didn't have any diagnosis. So first, when we consider the psychotic symptoms, we see that there is really no difference in verbal learning performance between those who have psychotic symptoms and those who do not have psychotic symptoms. So they really show comparable skills. But when we consider the psychotic spectrum disorders, we see that both groups have divergent developmental trajectories. So the group who later develop a psychotic disorder, so from around adolescent, really show a decrease already visible at around 10, 11 years old, while the group who do not develop a psychotic disorder show really an increase over time in their learning performance. So this may suggest that verbal learning skills may represent a cognitive marker for psychosis. And to conclude, so first we show that our results contrast with the current view of spared verbal learning skills. And one way to improve these verbal learning skills would be to provide encoding strategies. So for example, there's the scene visual imagery where we imagine a scene which includes the two words that we need to learn. And another result that we found was that there is a deterioration of verbal learning skills in those who later develop a psychotic disorder. And so this may represent a new cognitive marker in 22q. And so one possible clinical implication of this result is to regularly assess the verbal learning skills from childhood in order to identify those who have lower or decreasing verbal learning skills over time. And those individuals, so they may benefit from a more careful screening and a more careful monitoring of these psychotic symptoms. And so they would allow to detect the first signs of psychosis and to then enable an adequate intervention if needed. With that, I want to thank you all for your attention, as well as all my colleagues who helped with this study.